106. The Greeks, the Jews, the Egyptians, and God. Immortality never became the predominant belief regarding life after death. Egyptian or Persian. Gilman addresses the possibility of cultural borrowing for the idea of resurrection and posits two nations as the possible source of this doctrine, Egypt or Persia. Egypt is ruled out as a source since these Egyptian texts are significantly older, dating from the 3rd millennium BC, than the biblical material. None of their details corresponds to the biblical account. There is no clear way to trace the process of transmission, and these texts do not speak of a resurrection. Gilman concludes a Persian influence is more likely. Zoroastrian texts are closer in time to the Bible. They speak of resurrection. Further, from the middle of the 5th century BC on, Jews lived among Persians. However, there is no reason that the age of the original text would have any influence on whether the ideas contained therein were borrowed at a much later period. The ideas of the Egyptians were to last in the Mediterranean basin until they were destroyed by the Christians. After all, the Bible and a discussion was written almost 2,000 years ago. Since Gilman does not indicate what details he finds lacking, this position cannot be addressed. However, the concept of the soul, the judgment thereof, and the afterlife are clearly Egyptian. At the time the Jewish writings under discussion were written, as previously described, the Jews had lived with the Egyptians and the Egyptian influenced Greeks at least as long as the Persians. Again, the Zoroastrian idea of the resurrection, i.e., resurrection is a reconstituting of the creature by a reunion of its several elements, is strongly similar to Isis' resurrection of Osiris/Serapis since she had reconstituted the body of Osiris before his resurrection. This act was recalled in many of the Isisiac festivals celebrated throughout the Mediterranean basin, including the initial Isisiac temples in Palestine, and, hence, is as much likely to be the Jewish source of the idea of resurrection as Zoroastrian religion. As to an possible Egyptian contribution, Siegfried Morens had this to add. Christianity and Islam were in agreement with the basic outlook of the ancient Egyptians in that they also promised eternal life. They could therefore appeal to a very ancient attitude of mind. Who can say whether Egyptian mummies may not have had something to do with the Christian concept of resurrection of the flesh, which belongs neither to the Old Testament religion nor to that of the earliest Christians, let alone to that of the Greeks? To the Christian it may seem natural that man's everlasting life should be based upon God. But other religions, such as those of the Israelites and of the ancient Greeks, teach that God's power does not extend beyond the limits of this earthly existence. It cannot penetrate the dark realms of Sheol or the gates of Hades. Moreover, it is believed that it would take an action of tremendous social impact to cause the Jews to modify their religious views. While the exile by the Persians was such an act, it was generally seen by the Jews as the result of sins committed by Israel. As set forth by Jacob Neusner, for 3 since the ancient temple had fallen in 586 BC. Murder, adultery, idolatry. Bat D. Aman. 107. Jesus the Egyptian priest states, according to these authors, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and Hosea, Israel continued to suffer military and political setbacks because it had disobeyed God. But the people of Israel had sinned against him, and their military defeats and economic disasters represented God's punishment for their sins. But the persecution by Antiochus was not seen as related to any act of the Jews and therefore an injustice. As stated by Cohen, although the roots of the doctrine of resurrection are much older than the Book of Daniel, the major impulse to its acceptance by the Jews was the crisis of the mid-2nd century. For the first time in recorded history, a nation fought a battle for religious liberty. For the first time in Jewish history, men, women, and children were killed because they refused to violate the demands of the Torah. Just as the desecration of the temple and the persecution of Judaism provided the impulse for visions of national redemption, the death of the righteous martyrs provided the impulse for the belief in immortality and resurrection. In addition, as stated by Gilman, these two doctrines, bodily resurrection and spiritual immortality, seem to have entered Judaism independently. There is no evidence that the author of Daniel knew of spiritual immortality, nor that the author of the Wisdom of Solomon knew of bodily resurrection. In fact, the two doctrines could be viewed as contradictory. The first attributes afterlife to the body, the second, to the soul. The first says nothing about the soul, the second ignores the destiny of the body. In the later tradition, however, the two doctrines merge, and in this form, remain a centerpiece of Jewish eschatology into the modern age. If then, the idea of resurrection had entered Jewish thought as early as the Persian period, and since Jews frequently migrated from Palestine to Egypt, including a particularly large migration under Ptolemy I, there should have been strong indications of the concept of resurrection in the early Jewish havens of Egypt. As stated by Gilman, there are significant references to resurrection in the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal literature. These books, for example, Enoch 91:10, 92:2, 2 Maccabees 7, 4th Ezra 7 verse 32, the Testament of Benjamin 10:6-8, date from roughly the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century CE, and are not incorporated into the Jewish biblical canon, probably because of their late date, though many are included in some versions of the Christian canon. Bickerman, in discussion of one of these later books, presents this viewpoint. However agreeable the vision of flourishing sinners receiving their just punishment at the Great Judgment, Pseudo-Enoch understood that the righteous also needed to know what blessings awaited them. At this point he discloses the secret that he, the heavenly scribe, had learned from the tablets of heaven: the souls of the righteous will not perish, but will shine like the lights of heaven. The secret revealed by Enoch was a Greek one, that of stellar immortality. In Greek mythology, several heroes, as a reward for their merits, are spared from death and instead translated to the heavens to become brilliant stars, the Dioscuri and Andromeda, for instance. In the Hellenistic period, this lot came to be reserved by the 108. The Greeks, the Jews, the Egyptians, and God. Greeks for those rulers who deserve apotheosis. If we believe the poet Callimachus, Asino II, sister and spouse of Ptolemy II, ascended into the constellations at her death in 270 BC, 25 years later, Berenice III vowed a lock of her hair to the gods for the safe return of her husband, Ptolemy III, from the war against Syria, but it disappeared from the sanctuary. It was the gallant astronomer Conan who discovered that the gods had carried off Venus' hair and had placed it transformed into a group of brilliant stars in the sky. Callimachus celebrated this event, too, in a poem, and a constellation between the Great Bear and the Virgin bears the name the Lock of Berenice even today. What Pseudo-Enoch was promising his fellow sectarians was that one day they, too, would shine in the midst of the stars. Writing around 167 BC, amid Epiphanes' persecution of the Jews faithful to the traditional Siyuit, Pseudo-Enoch promises not only that God will deliver Israel in a short time, but also that at that time many of the dead will awaken, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting abhorrence, and some, the wise men who turned the many to righteousness, to shine as the stars forever and ever. Dan 12:2-3. It is not strange that the author of Daniel here uses an early Greek idea of stellar immortality, or, at least, an early Greek metaphor for blissful afterlife. He and the Maccabees were defending their faith, not fighting Greek civilization. However, it should be remembered that the idea of stellar immortality existed for thousands of years in Egypt before the birth of Greece and, hence, was only transmitted by the Greeks. While some scholars consider the idea of stellar immortality as Babylonian, Bickerman warns us the plain fact is that although we know only a very few things about the ideology of early Hellenistic Jerusalem, we know still less about contemporary religious developments in Alexandria or Antioch or among the Iranians. Yet modern scholars happily discover marks of Persian influence in the religion of the Hellenistic Jews. The later Babylonian faith became astral, and the idea of stellar immortality was a force among the Greeks of the later Hellenistic age, but the ritual texts in cuneiform copied and used in Hellenistic Babylonia offer no hint of star worship, to say nothing of an afterlife. The latter subject is not referred to in astrological texts, either. This appears to suggest that the Babylonian idea of stellar immortality could have entered too late to have been an influence on the Greeks. Bickerman's warning is well taken. It reminds us that the religion of Babylon, like that of Greece and the Jews, has a history, that is, it also has been subject to change. This raises an additional argument against Persian/Iranian/Zoroastrian influence. Robert Martin Ashad defines the problem. Against these arguments in support of a Jewish borrowing of the Iranian doctrine of the return of the perished to life, some scholars advance views tending to uphold the independence of Old Testament thought. Their main contention is that it is not easy to place the various scriptures that constitute the Avesta in chronological order. Among the mass of Iranian texts, there are some that date from the Christian era, while others are anterior to it by several centuries. It is particularly difficult to discover what the religion of the Persian monarchs was during the period when Jerusalem was under their rule. For example, according to H.S. Nyberg, the Achaemenids were not followers of Zarathustra, while, for E. Hertzfeld, Darius and his two immediate 109. Jesus the Egyptian priest successors were certainly faithful champions of Zoroastrian doctrine. As long as these problems are unsolved, the question of the relationship between the Persian and Jewish faiths remains complex. Jan N. Bremer has undertaken an attempt to clarify the dating of the texts and concludes, we have to make a distinction between the Old Avestan texts, of which Zoroaster perhaps was not the author, and the Young Avestan texts, which probably are at least half a millennium later. In fact, it is virtually certain that Zoroastrian belief in resurrection does not belong to its earliest stages. A later date is supported both by the doctrine of the journey of the soul to heaven, and the fact that the Zoroastrians delivered their dead to dogs and vultures. In the succeeding age the conception of the soul gradually changed, but the first and only Avestan text which undeniably mentions resurrection is Yast 19, a hymn of the Young Avesta that presumably dates from the time of the Achaemenids, 550 to 330 BC. We find our next passage in Theopompus Philippica, quoted by the pagan Diogenes Laertius. Unfortunately, we do not know the exact date of Theopompus' work. Having lived for some time at the court of Philip of Macedon, he eventually died in Ptolemaic Alexandria. It is therefore not unreasonable to assume that he collected his information from the Magi after Alexander's invasion of Persia. Rather strikingly, no other mention of resurrection in Iranian thought can be found before the Sasanian period, 224 to 637 CE, when the belief in an afterlife and resurrection was evidently much discussed. The time of the Achaemenids is after Persian contact with Egypt. The time of Alexander is of an extremely late period. Hence, it is possible that the aspects of resurrection found in Zoroastrianism also evolved from Egyptian concepts. However, this is not to say that there was no Persian contribution to Jewish wisdom. Martin Ashad states, they were, in fact, indebted to it, Persia, for their angelology, their satanology, and in particular their eschatology which, especially after the exile, assumes the character of a cosmic drama which is concerned not only with the lot of the Davidic kingship or even with that of the earth, but also with the destiny of the entire universe. Defining Ruah/Nafesh. Gilman has also asserted that every human possesses a soul which separated from the body at death and enjoys a continued existence with God is not in the Bible, i.e. Old Testament. What he means by this statement is that this concept would not be in a properly translated Bible. As conveyed by Jan N. Bremer, there is in ancient Hebrew no term equivalent to our soul. From the various words which together correspond to our notion of the soul, the most important one is nefesh, which seems to have combined the functions of the thymos and psyche of the living. It is probably connected with a root meaning breath and can often be translated life or life force. Unlike psyche, though, it never means the soul of the dead and is not contrasted with the body. Israelite anthropology was strictly Unitarian and remained so until the 1st century AD, when the Greek belief in an immortal soul started to gain ground in Palestine and the diaspora. As had been previously noted by Bickerman, certain mistranslations were made in the original Septuagint and were not corrected. Gilman indicates 110. The Greeks, the Jews, the Egyptians, and God. We have seen that 3 Hebrew terms later came to be used to designate the human soul, nefesh, neshama, and ruah. But in the Bible, the first of these primarily means neck or throat, then blood or breath, which passes through the neck or throat, and finally, by extension, an entity that has blood and breath, a living being. Exodus 1 verse 5, even one who was previously living. Numbers 6 verse 6. The second again typically designates a breath, or one that breathes. Psalm 150 verse 6, and again by extension, the living being. The third usually means a wind or breath and, in Job 34:14-15, is synonymous with neshama. None of these signifies an entity such as the soul of the later tradition, which is distinct from the body, and can then enjoy an existence independent of the body after death. In the Bible itself, the human is not a composite of 2 distinct entities, but rather a single entity, a breathing, living clod of earth. And death is understood as the going out or dissipation from the body of the life breath which originally. According to Genesis 2 verse 7, God breathed into the clod of earth, thus vivifying it. This life breath has none of the qualities which later came to be identified with the soul: awareness, a sense of self-identity and memory. Marcus J. Borg briefly summarizes the beliefs of the Jews in the time of Jesus. Throughout much of her history, ancient Israel apparently did not affirm an afterlife, and thus the rewards and punishments in much of the Old Testament are understood in these worldly terms. These traditions remained current in the time of Jesus. The belief in an afterlife emerged clearly only in the late post-exilic period, ca. 200 BC, in part because of the suffering of the righteous in this life, sometimes precisely because they were faithful. The belief in an afterlife appears around the time when the righteous within Judaism were being persecuted and even martyred. By the 1st century, perhaps most of the Jewish people had embraced the notion of an afterlife, though the Sadducees, an aristocratic group which included the high priestly circles, still did not. See Mark 12 verses 18-27, Acts 23 verses 6-8. An argument against Greek influence. Rabbi L. Kaplan Spitz, in an appendix to his Does the Soul Survive?, discusses the findings of Gilman and others and finds them unpersuasive. The positions taken by Rabbi Spitz are considered exemplary. Spitz contends the Israelite concept of soul emerged, developed internally, and persisted as a product of a shared human awareness that we are more than our bodies and that how we live this life shapes our fate for a realm to come. With reference to Gilman, he disputes his reading of the meaning of "and he was gathered to his people." Gilman had suggested that the phrase "it" simply suggests a good death. In contrast, Rabbi Spitz believes that "gathered to his people" signifies a duality of body and soul and suggests an afterlife. Spitz points out that the phrase is used 10 instances in the 5 books of Moses. Spitz realizes that this is not an explicit reference regarding the afterlife and therefore submits. 111. Jesus the Egyptian priest. It is natural to then ask, why does the Bible not make an explicit statement regarding the afterlife and survival of the soul? First, I think that Samson Raphael Hirsch, Germany, 1808 to 1888, was right when he responded, the belief in immortality of the soul was so routinely accepted in ancient times that there was no need to teach it as dogma. It was taken quite for granted that just as the dead body returned to earth, its source, so the soul would return to the spiritual plane from which it originated. Second, the Bible is implicitly responding to the death obsession around it in the pagan world. Death is played down as a religious focus. Third, the primary focus of the text is on shaping a communal covenant with God. The text strives to convince the audience that there is only one God who plays an active role in the people's lives and that living in covenant with God in their earthly existence is their major responsibility. In addition to the above, Spitz lists three general reasons for his belief. 1. The concept of soul is too common a human idea for the Israelites not to have come up with it independently. 2. The rabbis were very sensitive to the intrusion of foreign ideas into their faith and would have fought such a non-biblical idea. In fact, there are no recorded protests in the Talmud. 3. There are fundamental differences between Plato's concept of soul, widely claimed by modern scholars as the greatest influence on the rabbis, and rabbinic beliefs. For Plato, the body was a prison of the soul, and for the rabbis it was the medium of development and improvement. Plato described the soul as without beginning or end, while the rabbis maintained that all souls began at the time of the 6 days of creation. The soul progressed, according to Plato, through elevated ideas. The rabbis emphasized righteous deeds as the path to elevation. As for the assertion that the immortality of the soul was routinely accepted or common in ancient times, at this point it should be clear that this was not the case for the Mediterranean basin. Only in Egypt does evidence of belief in the soul exist before the Persian period. The evidence is conclusive that the Greeks of the Homeric period did not have such a belief. And, while the Zoroastrian texts, the religion of the Persians, probably dates from 1000 BCE, there is no evidence of a belief in the soul until around 500 BC. The differences noted between Plato's concept of the soul and the rabbis is more a matter of interpretation rather than actually. It was one of the major efforts of Plato to improve the body by developing the soul through the study of number, or what he called forms, thus, his academy. The rabbis studied Torah. Both methods led to the practice of righteous deeds. In any event, if we were to base what the Jews believed on what was common in the belief of most Mediterranean countries before the Persian invasion of Egypt, we would have to conclude that the Jews did not believe in the soul. It is true that the people who would later be called rabbis fought non-biblical ideas, but while the record of this fight may be missing in the Talmud, they are recorded in both history and the New Testament and will be discussed in the following chapter. 112. Acts and Actors. 7 Acts and Actors. Map from New Testament times Marol C. Tenney. Previously, it was stated that the Mediterranean basin was more like a patchwork quilt than a blanket. This was also true of the lands now known as Israel. Thus, as explained by Daniel J. Harrington, the first methodological problem pertaining to Jesus in his Jewish context is the nature of Palestinian Judaism in Jesus' time. It appears to have been quite diverse and multifaceted. Around the time of Christ, Israel was in a formative period, that is, a period that was well prepared for the formulation and acceptance of new ideas. There was a rich variety of Jewish religious expression in this period due to the fact that for much of Jewish Palestine, Judaism was a relatively new phenomenon. Herod was the grandson of pagans. Similarly, the entire Galilee had been converted to Judaism only 120 years before the Common Era. In the later expansion of the Hasmonean kingdom, other regions were forcibly brought within the fold. The Hasmoneans, or Maccabees, used Judaism imperially, as a means of winning the loyalty of the pagan Semites in the 113. Jesus the Egyptian priest. Regions of Palestine they conquered. As explained by Paul Johnson, the Hasmoneans began as the avengers of martyrs, they ended as religious oppressors themselves. They came to power at the head of an eager guerrilla band, they ended surrounded by mercenaries. Their kingdom, founded in faith, dissolved in impiety. He describes their religious campaign of expansion. John Hyrcanus was imbued with the fundamentalist notion that it was God's will he should restore the Davidic kingdom. He was the first Jew to seek military inspiration and geopolitical guidance from the ancient historical texts of the Bible, telescoping the books of Joshua and Samuel. He accepted as literal truth that the whole of Palestine was the divine inheritance of the Jewish nation, and that it was not merely his right but his duty to conquer it. To do this, he created a modern army of mercenaries. Moreover, the conquest, like Joshua's, had to extirpate foreign cults and heterodox sects, and if necessary slaughter those who clung to them. John's army trampled down Samaria and razed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. He stormed, after a year's siege, the city of Samaria itself, when he demolished it entirely, and brought streams to it to drown it, for he dug ditches to turn it into floods and water meadows. He even took away the very marks which showed a city had ever been there. In the same way he pillaged and burned the Greek city of Scythopolis. John's wars of fire and sword were marked by massacres of city populations whose only crime was that they were Greek-speaking. The province of Idumea was conquered and the inhabitants of its two main cities, Adora and Marissa, were forcibly converted to Judaism or slaughtered if they refused. Alexander Jannaeus, John's son, took this policy of expansion and forcible conversion still further. He invaded the territory of the Decapolis, the League of 10 Greek-speaking cities grouped around the Jordan. He swept into Nabatea and took Petra, the rose-red city halt as old as time. He moved into the province of Golamptis. The Hasmoneans pushed north into the Galilee and Syria, west to the coast, south and east into the desert. Behind their frontiers they eliminated pockets of non-Jewish people by conversion, massacre or expulsion. The Jewish nation thus expanded vastly and rapidly in terms of territory and population, but in doing so it absorbed large numbers of people who, though nominally Jewish, were also half Hellenized and in many cases were fundamentally pagans or even savages. As the result of the imperialistic actions of the Hasmoneans, there was a conglomeration of beliefs and a varying depth of belief among the people of the Jewish nation, as expressed by Jacob Neusner. But in a brief period of 3 or 4 generations, the deeply rooted practices of the Semitic natives of Galilee, Idumea, and other areas could not have been wiped out. They were rather covered over with a veneer of monotheism. Hence the newly converted territories, though vigorously loyal to their new faith, were no more Judaized in so short a time than were the later Russians, Poles, Celts, or Saxons Christianized within a century. It took a great effort to transform an act of 114 acts and actors. Circumcision of the flesh, joined with a mere verbal affirmation of one God, done under severe duress, into a deepening commitment to faith. And yet in the War of 66 CE the Jews of newly converted regions fought with great loyalty. While the Galileans had proved unable to stand upon the open battlefield, many of them together with Idumeans retreated to the holy city. There they gave their lives in the last great cataclysms of the war. The exceptional loyalty of the newly converted regions would lead one to suppose that it was to the temple cult, to the god whom it served, and to the nation that supported it that the pagan Semites were originally converted. They could have known little of the more difficult service of the heart through study of Torah and ethical and moral action which the Pharisees demanded. While the central teachings of the faith were very ancient, adherents of many who professed it was therefore only relatively recent and superficial. The religious beliefs of recently converted people could not have encompassed ideas and issues requiring substantial study, elaborate schooling, and a well-established pattern of living. Conversion of one group to another faith never obliterates the former culture, but rather entails the translation of the new into the idiom of the old, so that in the end it results in a modification of both. The newly Judaized regions similarly must have preserved substantial remnants of their former pagan Semitic and Hellenistic cultures. The inhabitants could not have been greatly changed merely by receiving Judaism, which meant in the beginning little more than submitting to the knife of the circumciser rather than to the sword of the slaughterer. Only after many generations was the full implication of conversion realized in the lives of the people in Galilee, and then mainly because great centers of Tannaitic law and teaching were established among them. For this period, however, no such thing as a normative Judaism existed, from which one or another heretical group might diverge. Not only in the great center of the faith, Jerusalem, do we find numerous competing groups, but throughout the country and abroad we may discern a religious tradition in the midst of great flux. It was full of vitality, but in the end without a clear and widely accepted view of what was required of each individual, apart from acceptance of Mosaic revelation. And this could mean whatever you wanted. People would ask one teacher after another, "What must I do to enter the kingdom of heaven?" precisely because no authoritative answer existed. Neusner refers to the work of Morton Smith, which declares, "If there was any such thing, then, as an orthodox Judaism, it must have been that which is now almost unknown to us, the religion of the average people of the land." But the different parts of the country were so different, such gulfs of feeling and practice separated Idumea, Judea, Caesarea, and Galilee, that even on this level there was probably no more agreement between them than between any one of them and a similar area in the diaspora. And in addition to the local differences, the country swarmed with special sects, each devoted to its own tradition. 115. Jesus the Egyptian priest. Elias Bickerman states, "No organized body of religious doctrine was taught in pre-Maccabean Jerusalem. Theological casuistry, such as the distinction between fearing God and loving Him, came later, as an offshoot of Greek dialectics. Akiba, in the 2nd century CE, was more influenced by Greek thought than Ben Sira had been 3 centuries before. Given this environment, it should come as no surprise that one small group of activists among competing groups could be effective in placing their viewpoint of the nature of things foremost and therefore securely in history. This winning group was called the Pharisees. As disclosed by Neusner, we have 3 sources of information about the Pharisees and the other competing groups. Each has its own point of view and field of interest. The sources are Josephus, the Gospel writings, and the record preserved by the rabbis. The closest to being a historical document is the writings of Josephus, a Jewish historian who, between 75 and ca. 100 CE, wrote the history of the Jews from the beginnings to the destruction of Jerusalem, including the war against Rome which had led to the destruction. However, Josephus' presentation could be considered apologetic since it is engaged in explaining to the Jewish world of his day that Rome was not at fault for the destruction of the temple, and in telling the Roman world that the Jewish people had been misled and therefore were not to be held responsible for the terrible war. The Gospel writings are primarily directed to presenting not a specific history but to illuminate in the best manner the teachings of Jesus and, hence, show little interest in the Pharisees, except as a convenient basis for polemic or narrative. The rabbinical legislators show no keen interest in narrative, biographical, or historical problems, but take as their task the promulgation of laws for the government and administration of the Jewish community. This is how Josephus described the actors or the competing philosophies of early Israel. 2. The Jews had for a great while 3 sects of philosophy peculiar to themselves, the sect of the Essenes, and the sect of the Sadducees, and the third sort of opinions was that of those called Pharisees. 3. Now, for the Pharisees, they live meanly, and despise delicacies in diet, and they follow the conduct of reason, and what that prescribes to them as good for them, they do, and they think they ought earnestly to strive to observe reason's dictates for practice. They also pay a respect to such as Irenaeus, or nor are they so bold as to contradict them in anything which they have introduced, and, when they determine that all things are done by fate, they do not take away the freedom from men of acting as they think fit, since their notion is that it hath pleased God to make a temperament whereby what he wills is done, but so that the will of men can act virtuously or viciously. They also believe that souls have an immortal vigor in them, and that under the earth there will be rewards or punishments according as they have lived virtuously or viciously in this life, and the latter are to be detained in an everlasting prison, but that the former shall have power to revive and live again, on account of 116. Acts and actors. Which doctrines, they are able greatly to persuade the body of the people, and whatsoever they do about divine worship, prayers, and sacrifices, they perform them according to their direction, insomuch that the cities gave great attestations to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in the actions of their lives and their discourses also. But the doctrine of the Sadducees is this, that souls die with the bodies, nor do they regard the observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them, for they think it an instance of virtue to dispute with those teachers of philosophy whom they frequent, but this doctrine is received but by a few, yet by those still of the greatest dignity, but they are able to do almost nothing of themselves, for when they become magistrates, as they are unwillingly and by force sometimes obliged to be, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees, because the multitude would not otherwise bear them. 5. The doctrine of the Essenes is this, that all things are best ascribed to God. They teach the immortality of souls, and esteem that the rewards of righteousness are to be earnestly striven for, and when they send what they have dedicated to God into the temple, they do not offer sacrifices, because they have more pure lustrations of their own, on which account they are excluded from the common court of the temple, but offer their sacrifices themselves, yet is their course of life better than that of other men, and they entirely addict themselves to husbandry. It also deserves our admiration how much they exceed all other men that addict themselves to virtue, and this in righteousness, and indeed to such a degree, that as it hath never appeared among any other man, neither Greeks nor barbarians, no, not for a little time, so hath it endured a long while among them. This is demonstrated by that institution of theirs which will not suffer anything to hinder them from having all things in common, so that a rich man enjoys no more of his own wealth than he who hath nothing at all. Shea J. D. Cohen summarizes Josephus' description and provides us with a bit more information in stating each group advocates certain doctrines about fate, free will, and immortality, precisely the questions that should be addressed by philosophical schools. Josephus explicitly compares the Pharisees with the Stoics and the Essenes with the Pythagoreans, and implicitly compares the Sadducees with the Epicureans. The Sadducees do not allocate fate any role in human affairs, and they deny both immortality of the soul and resurrection. The Essenes ascribe all human actions to the power of fate and believe in both immortality and resurrection. The Pharisees adopt a middle course, ascribing power to both fate and human free will, and believing in immortality and resurrection, but apparently in a way different from the Essenes. This point is not clear. As to the use of philosophy to describe these schools, it should be remembered that in the ancient world of this period, there was no word for religion. What existed were wisdom systems that attempted to describe all that exists in one comprehensive framework. The word philosophy is considered Greek and means lover of wisdom. As stated by Morton Smith, Judaism to the ancient world was a philosophy. That world had no general term for religion. It could speak of a particular system of rites, a cult, or an initiation. 117. Jesus the Egyptian priest. Or a particular set of beliefs, doctrines, or opinions, or a legal code, or a body of national customs or traditions, but for the peculiar synthesis of all this which we call a religion, the one Hellenistic word which came closest was philosophy. So when Judaism first took shape and became conscious of itself and its own peculiarity in the Hellenized world of the later Persian Empire, it described itself with the Hellenic term meaning the wisdom of its people, Deuteronomy 4:6. Not only did the ancient Jews call their wisdom system philosophy, but some were known to act like the philosophers of that era. Not only was the theory of the Pharisaic school that of a school of Greek philosophy, but so were its practices. Its teachers taught without pay, like philosophers. They attached to themselves particular disciples who followed them around and served them, like philosophers. They looked to gifts for support, like philosophers. They were exempt from taxation, like philosophers. They were distinguished in the street by their walk, speech, and peculiar clothing, like philosophers. They practiced and praised asceticism, like philosophers. And finally, what is, after all, the meat of the matter, they discussed the questions philosophers discussed and reached the conclusions philosophers reached. According to Cohen, the Pharisees appear as a political party in the time of John Hyrcanus, 137 to 104 BC, Ptolemy Alexandra, 76 to 67 BC, Herod the Great, 97 to 34 BC, and in the first year of the Great Revolt, 66 to 67 CE. Several politically important individuals from the time of Herod and the outbreak of the revolt are called Pharisees. The Sadducees, in contrast, appear only once as a political party, when Hyrcanus joins them and abandons the Pharisees, and only one individual is ever called a Sadducee, the high priest of the 1st century CE. The Essenes never appear as a political group, although individual Essenes are occasionally mentioned. One calculation is that during the Herodian period there were about 8 million Jews in the world, of whom 2,230,000 to 2,500,000 lived in Palestine. And, of the more than 2 million Jews in Palestine, only 6,000 were Pharisees, and 4,000 were Essenes who lived in villages and towns throughout the land of Israel. Only 200 Essenes lived at Qumran, home of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Gospel, the Pharisees are depicted as rigid, inflexible, legalistic nitpickers. They were shown as ruthless critics of Jesus for seemingly minor offenses of curing people of the Sabbath or his disciples eating with unclean hands. However, their view of themselves is revealed in their own voluminous literature, including prayers, hymns, books of wisdom, law books, sermons, commentaries on the Bible, mystical treatises, books of history, and many other genres, paint a far different picture. Far from being arid ritualists, they were one of the most creative groups in history. Hyam Maccabi suggests that the Pharisees, far from being rigid and inflexible in applying religious laws, were noted, as the 1st century historian Josephus points out, and as is amply confirmed in the Pharisee law books, for the leniency of their legal rulings, and for the humanity and flexibility with which they sought to adapt the law of the Bible to changing conditions and improved moral conceptions. They were able to do this because, though they regarded the Bible as the inspired word. 118. Acts and Actors of God, they did not take a literalist view of the interpretation of the Bible. The Pharisees made law by a vigorous debate of the issues, and once a majority consensus was achieved, the minority was required to support the majority viewpoint. Indeed, this is the manner in which most legislatures operate. In fact, the story is told that even God could not override majority decisions. Among the Pharisees, a majority vote was regarded with such seriousness that there was a legend amongst them that God had once attempted to intervene to reverse one of these majority decisions, by telling them through a voice from heaven that the minority opinion was correct, but had been told that he was out of order, since he himself had given the sages the power of decision by vote. And he himself had said in his Torah that the Torah, is not in heaven, Deuteronomy 30 verse 12, by which the sages understood that the Torah was to be applied and administered by the processes of human intellect, not by miracles or divine intervention. God's reaction to this, the legend continues, was to laugh and say, "My children have defeated me." Thus the Pharisees avoided the option, open to all religions based on a scripture believed to be divinely inspired, of adding the infallibility of the Church to the infallibility of scripture. Instead, they developed the concept of a scriptural canon, which was the center of human attention and was constantly being scrutinized in the light of the human intellect, and, even more important, they had the idea that God himself wished this process of human reasoning to go on without interruption by himself, and that he approved the struggles of the human mind to interpret his design for the universe, even if these efforts were not free of error. According to the effort is the reward. Thus the Pharisees were able to disagree with each other without quarreling and without persecution of dissenting views, for difference of opinion was itself an essential ingredient of their concept of the religious life, rather than a danger to it. As a matter of fact, while the Gospels dramatizes the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, for the purpose of history, the most important conflicts were between Jesus and the Pharisees against the Sadducees. Indeed, on issues relating to philosophy, the closeness in the positions taken by Jesus and the Pharisees has caused some scholars to claim Jesus was a Pharisee, for example, Hayam Maccabi. Others, while noting the closeness in the philosophy, indicated that they are hesitant before so doing, for example Gezavamis. Josephus describes the reasons for friction between the Pharisees and Sadducees.